not a very stable situation. Yes. And in Pakistan, since last year, there has been instability with the recently the most unprecedented development of a former ISI chief being arrested. The India-China border issue in Eastern Ladakh still awaits resolution. It has not been resolved despite multiple rounds of both at the military and political level talks. And in Myanmar, the rebels and the government are at war. So there is a sort of turbulence in the region. And this impacts India's regional security, its foreign policy, its economy, and also its global trajectory. I mean, India has been on a rising trajectory, its GDP rising from just after the reforms, economic liberalization began in 91 to 16th largest GDP to 2 years ago, 5th largest GDP, and growing much faster post-pandemic than most of the large economies. So it's on an upward trajectory. But can this can regional turbulence disturb this, or how will it impact it? Is something which Indian scholars need to think about. You can have a situation. I mean, there is a bandwagoning versus balancing theory in international relations theory about how the rise of a new pole can create either bandwagoning or balancing. And what we are seeing is we're not seeing bandwagoning. I mean, we are seeing kind of a hedging behavior with China competing for influence in all of India's neighbors. I mean, the SAARC is effectively dead, and BIMSTEC, the eastward regional organization, has not really taken off. So we are in a turbulent and uncertain situation. How this will play out is a question which we will discuss in this webinar. And we have three distinguished speakers here. Let me introduce them in the order in which they'll speak. Professor Rajesh Rajagopalan is professor at the Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament at Jawaharlal Nehru University, JNU. And previously, he was a senior fellow at the Observer Research Foundation and a research fellow at the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis in Delhi. He also served as Deputy Secretary in the National Security Council Secretariat of the Government of India. And his areas of research interest are international relations theory, military doctrines, nuclear weapons, and disarmament. And then we have our second speaker will be Professor Imtiaz Hussain. He is a professor at the Department of Global Studies and Governance in the School of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences at the Independent University, Bangladesh. He has published widely on international relations and politics, author of more than 20 books. And he will, hopefully throw light on what's happening in Bangladesh, which is the most turbulent one of India's neighbors in the immediate scenario. And then we will have the third speaker will be Professor Srinath Raghavan, who is Professor of International Relations and History at Ashoka University. And he has previously taught at King's College London. He is the author, editor of several books, and he won the prestigious Infosys Prize for Social Sciences in 2015. So with this brief introduction of our three distinguished speakers, let me hand the floor over to Professor Rajesh Rajagopal. Thank you. We'll have speakers will speak to up to about 20 minutes each, and then we'll have a Q&A session. And to conserve speaking time, if you can please send in your questions on the chat box, and then I'll throw them to the speakers one by one. Thanks a lot. So, Professor Rajesh Rajagopal.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Sridharan, for inviting me to UPIASI also. This is, of course, an important topic. This, as you mentioned, it's very topical, considering all that is going on around India, in the entire region. So there is definitely, we could characterize that as enormously turbulent. And it has obviously implications that you mentioned also. So I will sort of broadly make about 3 points. I'll elaborate on this, but broadly the 3 points that I'll make is that obviously there is no doubt that the region is undergoing a certain amount of turbulence. I will discuss some of the reasons for that turbulence. Second, I would also look at, I would also suggest that this current turbulence will continue for a period of time, and it will probably even possibly become worse from India's perspective. So India does face a period maybe of several decades of rather troubled neighborhood. So this is not, I would not suggest this is a passing phase. I think this is here to stay for a period of time. Finally, I would also suggest that there is no, from India's view at least, that there is no simple solution to this. India will just have to learn to live with that turbulence. India will have to learn to manage that turbulence. And on the positive side, there is some indication that India is doing just that, that we are learning to, that our security managers are learning to live with it, are learning to understand how to sort of manage this turbulence in the neighborhood. So to take the first point about the turbulence itself, two ways of looking at turbulence in the region. One, of course, is what is happening within India's neighbors, and that is Dr. Sridharan mentioned all the specific issues that are going on within Bangladesh, in Pakistan, in Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and so on and so forth. And that was always the case. At some level, there has been some level of turbulent domestic politics of all of our neighbors, just as there is turbulence in Indian politics also. And sometimes that turbulence has also spilled over and affected India. Plenty of cases that one can mention, whether it is the Sri Lankan Tamils or the JVP, or obviously Bangladesh crisis, Afghanistan, Maldives. All of them, there have been instances of all of these having an effect, spilling over from domestic politics into regional politics, or at least affecting India directly. So that is something very traditional. It's not something new. But I would suggest that the turbulence that India faces right now is a much more serious step. It's not the traditional type that we've had, and that change happens mainly because of the factor that Dr. Sridhar mentioned, which is China's rise and China's entry into the region. Maybe not entry, but China's presence in the region, China's growing effect on the region within the Indian neighborhood, within India's neighborhood. So in a sense, it encompasses the first type of turbulence, which is the domestic politics, but also there is a second type, which is the international aspect of it, which is China's involvement in it, which makes the domestic political aspect of it a lot more complicated. It has effect that it has in India, and the effect that it has on regional international politics is somewhat more complicated than what India has traditionally faced. So to understand that change, I think we need to sort of take a step back, look at the politics of region became India was and remains about 70 to 80% of South Asia's wealth, its military power, natural resources, territory, people. I mean, any measure of power that you have, India was overwhelmingly dominant within the region. Obviously, the region is not entirely insular, but if you take the region as an insular region, then within that region, India has been overwhelmingly dominant. This, from the perspective of our neighbors, of course, that condition of Indian dominance made that even worse is the fact that there wasn't any external powers that are particularly interested in in the region sufficiently to help them. At least, even if they were interested in the region, they were not interested in helping India's neighbors balance against India. At least not in a consistent manner. And, Dr. Sridhar mentioned um, uh, balancing and bandwagoning. In most of the cases, even when external powers were involved, the US prominent of them. They're heavily focused on somebody else. So the US effort whether you're talking about the 50s treaty with Pakistan or subsequently in Afghanistan during the Afghan war or whatever, the focus was not India, and the focus was the Soviet Union, the focus was the global Cold War, and so on. So, which meant basically that their attention wandered. And so it was not, they had external powers had no real capacity or had no real interest in balancing against India. So for most of our India's neighbors, therefore, that enormous disparity in power within the region was made worse by the fact that they had really no extra regional help to deal with the India problem from their perspective. China, yes, China especially after 62 was more intent on balancing against India, but they really did not have the capacity to be able to do anything very much, and we see that in 65 or 71. The capacity was much more limited than the United States, and so that was not really something that they could do much about, even if they were intent on balancing against India. So the change that has happened in that is of course China's power, and that power that the expansion of China's influence that comes as a consequence of China's power, China's growing power. So in that sense, India's neighbors now do have a choice, unlike the United States earlier. In the region, in a haphazard manner occasionally. But unlike that, today we have China, which is much more, both more interested in balancing against India and has the capacity in terms of helping India's neighbors to balance against India. India being the neighbor and China being further away does represent, from the perspective of our neighbors at least, an easier choice, since that obviously they are not as concerned as India. So distance threats dissipate with distance, and so what we have their concern primarily, therefore, is India, which is their neighbor, rather than China, which is further away. So China, therefore, becomes automatically an option to balance against India. And of course, China is also, unlike the US earlier, China is also interested in providing that assistance, and so in helping the region balance against India. So the Chinese intervention or Chinese entry into the region is not unlike the United States, which was for a purpose that had nothing to do with the region itself. It was for the larger global Cold War. In the Chinese case, it is not the larger contest with the United States, or to the extent that it is the larger contest with the United States, it is a secondary sort of purpose. The primary purpose is to balance against India, to ensure that India, which is one of the more capable potential balances against China, is contained within the region. So there is, in that sense, unlike the haphazard American intervention within South Asia, Chinese intervention has been and will continue to be much more consistent and much more serious from India's perspective. So in that sense, India, the help that India's neighbors can expect from China is far more consistent and far more serious than what they could have expected from other countries. So to some extent, we are seeing a reflection of that in the domestic politics of India's neighbors. So campaigns like the India Out campaign, which started in Maldives, and now we see echoes of that in Bangladesh, has it's not a surprise that those kinds of campaigns start in the neighborhood, because there is 20 years, 30 years back, that would have been more difficult to manage, or more difficult to sort of have such a campaign, because they would be afraid of what Indian reaction would be. Today, that concern is mitigated by the fact that China does provide some support or some cause for comfort in that kind of in engaging those kinds of those kinds of activities. So there is, of course, a domestic political context also, because you will have in any democracy you will have multiple sides, and so you will have the opposition always in all of our neighbors, in all of the neighbors, you will have the opposition automatically targeting the government, which is the governments will always, of course, have to have a closer relationship with India, but you will therefore have the opposition that would be much more would be willing to target the government for that reason. Again, now that with China, they provides a kind of provides a certain amount of support for those kinds of politics. So that kind of domestic politics, in a sense, also becomes much more intensified as a consequence of that changed international condition and China's much more vigorous presence in the region. And so you're seeing that in a number of places. It's not that domestic politics was not there, obviously, earlier, but that that intensity of the international political context within domestic politics in many of these countries, whether it is in Bangladesh or in or in Maldives or in Sri Lanka, are all indications of that changed circumstance that we face now. This does mean that India's position in the domestic politics of its neighbors have become much more precarious and needs to be handled with greater care. The other point that I mentioned was that this condition that India faces in the neighborhood is also something that will not change in the near future. And the reason I mentioned that is because China's power is something that is long-lasting, obviously, and the gap between India and China is something that is not going to be closed in the near future. In fact, the gap is getting worse with each passing year, because even though India is growing slightly faster, obviously the base that China's base is much larger, and therefore even the slightly faster growth rate that India has isn't going to make very much difference in terms of the overall balance of power. And so that for the next several decades, India is going to have to deal with that power disparity with China, which means that there will also be there for a certain amount of consequence within the region. So obviously within India there is a certain amount of pride about India becoming the fifth largest economy or whatever. But that doesn't really mean very much, because Chinese economy is something like close to 20, but somewhere around $18-20 trillion. The next biggest economy, Japan, is what, $5-6 trillion, somewhere around that. So even if India does overtake Japan at some point, the gap is still huge. And so that absolute gap being so massive does mean that it will be decades before India can expect to catch up to get anywhere close to China. And so there will be potentially decades of this particular of Chinese presence in India within the region, and that would automatically mean decades of contest over South Asia. So how bad is the situation? How bad can the situation get? It is worse than before, in the sense that it is obviously better for India if India were the dominant power within the region. But it is also not entirely unmanageable, in the sense that India's neighbors have no interest in aligning with China, because for the simple reason that once you align, you lose any chance of playing one off against the other, which is their primary. India's neighbors, just like India during the Cold War period, playing the United States off against the Soviet Union. Non-alignment is a strategy that enhances your options and gives you the best of both worlds. And so India's neighbors have an interest in actually having India and China compete for influence within the region. They don't have any interest in aligning with China or India. If they aligned, obviously they will lose that possibility of getting these two countries compete. And of course, the other advantage for India is that at one level a disadvantage, which is that India is the neighborhood power. But it also has an advantage, which is that ultimately India's neighbors, given the disparity in power, would not really want to antagonize India too much, and therefore they understand red lines. They understand red lines like no foreign military bases and things of that kind. So that in that sense they also have they are unlikely to engage in behavior um, that crosses any Indian red lines. So we are seeing we see these efforts. We have seen these efforts in Sri Lanka. We've seen this more recently in Maldives, even Bangladesh, which Dr. Sridhar mentioned. We are seeing that as soon as the immediate crisis is over, the governments try to find find some sort of a understanding with India, or try to moderate their position. So even if they came to power as part of the opposition with India out campaigns and things of that kind, as soon as they come to power, they will find a way to modulate that position and find a way of working with India, because that those kinds of politics might make sense when you're in the opposition, but doesn't make much sense once you are in power already. And so what you do have is in all of these cases, once a change of power takes place, you see them swinging back to the center, as in finding a way of working with India and letting India and China compete for influence within those countries. So what the advantage of that, of course, is that it gives India an opening in all of these cases. India does. It's not as if the contest is over. India can and has to compete. I mean, so it's no longer India can no longer do what it did historically, which was basically ignore the region, not take care of its at least not take care of its neighbors in a serious manner. Other than rhetoric, there wasn't sufficient attention, sufficient delivery. But what we do see is that in the last 10 years, definitely India's performance in the region, in the neighborhood, has improved as a result of the competition. So I think so in that sense, India, of course, has to improve its game, but it has already improved the game. And so that's a point that I made, the third point that I made, which is that yes, the situation is worse than what it was before for India. But on the other hand, it also has it's not a lost cause, as it were. I mean, it's India has to learn to compete, and that means partly more care in handling India's neighbors, but also better capacity to deliver on the promises that India makes in the neighborhood, and cooperation with others, I mean, with Japan, with the United States, others, in terms of competing with China in the neighborhood. So it's not so. This is something that is going to go on for a while. So it is there is little point in complaining about it. India just has to understand that the neighborhood will take advantage of India, as it will take advantage of China, and that is the nature of this particular kind of game. And so there is, but the fact is that the game is a continuing game. So it will go on for a while, and India will hopefully get better than it is, and it has already gotten better over the last decade. So let me stop here, and I can happy to take some questions later.
Thank you, Professor Rajagopalan. Now, so that we stick within the time frame, I hand over the floor right away to Professor Imtiaz Hussain of the Independent University of Bangladesh.
I want to thank all of you, especially in the Institute, to my panelists. Great to see you and hear you, and a whole fleet of listeners in the audience from different parts of the world. Thank you for coming. I hope we can deliver something for you. The subject of my discussion is certainly India's most durable local ally, and that is Bangladesh. In the 36 day July revolution, for example, we have seen that so many things are happening and they're still unfolding. We need to start cultivating them and try to get some sense out of them. And so much has happened. Next, please, Ranjini. Next page. The two dimensions I would like to look at are the domestic and the international. And within both of them, I also have different subdivisions. Next, please, Ranjini.
Yeah, it's taking a bit of a time to just shift
Oh,
to the next. Just a minute.
Not a problem. I'll just proceed
Yeah.
without. Okay, this is just the overview what I'm going to talk about. There'll be 4 sections to the presentation. And the first one is where I was looking at the domestic and the external within Bangladesh. Then there are lateral forces. And here I think democracy is going to be one of them. The other one will be the economic growth rate. And this is where I'm not on the same page as Professor Raghavan, because I think that the China card played a lot less in Bangladesh than the domestic issues. Both of them played important roles, but certainly the domestic in Bangladesh was dominant and still remains so, not to mention that China will not play a big role later. Then I will look at the geopolitics, and you can go on to the next page, please, Ranjini. And then I'll draw some conclusions, 6 of them, and the implications. My driving questions are basically, how will Bangladesh's caretaker government treat India? And on the reciprocal side, in India, we're finding 2 scenarios. One is on what I call Main Street. It could be even grassroots. And here, the Bangladesh image is rather negative. And then there are the policymakers where it is slightly more, sometimes considerably more positive. So we need to bring those 2 levels of analysis within India into the analysis here. And as you can see, the politics, one part of the domestic and economics. Within the politics, I'm just looking at 3 or 4 different issues. One is the governmental change. And what Bangladesh has been experiencing is a zero-sum mindedness. It's either the Awami League or the BNP, and this is still going on. And therefore, we cannot have proper democracy with that mindset. And somehow it needs to be changed. I turn to the second, the caretaker government, steeringly, Dr. Yunus and the advisors are there. But among the front seat passengers, certainly the BNP, the Jamaati Islam, and you also have the student reformers who were the original catalyzers of the movement. And we are beginning to see differences between BNP and Jamaati, certainly over when elections should be held. BNP wants it on a very fast pace, but Jamaati is not that much in a quickie mindset. And then on the back seat are all the other parties. And one thing you notice here, Awami League is not in the picture. And this is something that must be somehow taken care of if we're going to have a proper democratic election. It is a dominant party. It might not be the most popular, but just because of a few bad apples, it doesn't mean the party must also be buried, which is basically what is happening presently. Among the month-long consequences, which is the third of my items under politics. Among all of that, as I just mentioned, we are beginning to see some fissures between the BNP and the Jamaat-e-Islam. And the zero-mindedness is still there in the sense that the Awami League is not in the picture. And somehow it has to get back in. Economics, I will not say much because in 1 month, it's hard to make a short-term perspective or conclusion from it. But these are the areas where we are facing problems. The first one is employment, excuse me, employment, and that's because investment is being chopped down. There are too many factories closed. And so there are difficulties all around to get the machine moving. And this is also helping foreign exchange. We have relied so much on RMG and remittances. These are going to be hit without the production that we need. Infrastructures, many of them have not been completed. We see in Dhaka, even the metro had to be stopped for a while because of the disruptions from the revolution. So these need to be back in full swing for the economy to move. And finally, there are the migrants. And the key factor here is that we have lots of Indians working in Bangladesh, between 500,000 to 1 million. And we've seen that right now, Bangladesh is the 4th largest source of foreign remittances for India. So that means a lot of money is going from here to India, and many of them are not wage labor. A lot of them are salary level workers. And so therefore, we have big problems of how we are going to bring them into some kind of harmony. If we look outside, we see a lot of other problems happening. There are, again, two sides. There are the bilateral, and the second will be the regional or global context. Within the bilateral, we have all the political situation that we have. And one could be we can work for the status quo, and that is what we are doing with China. We can work at improving relations, and that's where Pakistan may be the best example right now. And then one area where there could be worsening of relations. And if we look at the tightening of borders with India, maybe India has 1 foot here, another foot in the status quo. Many of the projects we have done with India, the Agartala railway line has been stopped for a while, and Khulna shipyard terminal was given last November to India. That also is at the moment standstill. And like that, India before would have the look east and act east, two policies of India, look east being Manmohan Singh's and act east being Narendra Modi. The former was much more favorable to Bangladesh. Many of the projects were going through Bangladesh, but act east is going east, but avoiding Bangladesh. And so using Myanmar to get to Kolkata and Chennai, for example, the Kalyan multimodal transit project, that is one of them. So these are the ways that in Bangladesh is being slightly marginalized in India's Eastern approach. And this is not helping much, especially as Myanmar is moving towards irreversible civil war. So we have huge problems there. They're going to get worse. And I don't think that South Asia will be from the spillovers. If with the Bay of Bengal, because of the ports that have been opened in Myanmar on the bay, one by China, one by India, Sitwe, and so forth, these are creating, and then Japan has Matarbari. So we have 3 of the Quad members there, and this is creating the other friction that we have had with the United States. And if the former prime minister is correct that the United States wanted St. Martin's Island, then we are basically attracting all the great powers here. So the Quad is there, and of course, with Russia preparing Rupur nuclear plant, which also India is part of that, we also have then kind of a Cold War getting in the new configuration globally. Can I have the next page, please? And how am I doing with time? Cannot see it. This is just an overview.
You have about 7-8 minutes.
Good, thank you, Shri. This is just an overview that, you know, politics is not everything, and I'm emphasizing democracy. That does play a big part. And here's one of the reasons why. It just gives you this year's Freedom House figures of where we stand in terms of democracy. And we can see that all the countries are partially free. They're not at all completely free, and some of them are even declining. Bangladesh had total of 40 points. The fourth column, you will notice 40 points, and that's what it had last year. So we are basically stranded, and it might improve a little bit for this year, but it might also slide backwards. Then if you look at India, there's also a question of stagnation. 66 is not far ahead of Bangladesh. And Pakistan, that also opens up a can of worms. Sri Lanka might be getting better. Tomorrow's the election. Let's see what happens. And I've thrown in Iran and Myanmar just to show the status after partly free. It could get worse. And so there are neighbors with worse figures. On the right-hand side are the economic pictures. And here also you notice a couple of important changes. Growth rate is going down everywhere. Still, Bangladesh lies behind India, and the world has been depending on these two for quite some time, all of this century. How much longer we can continue, we don't know. Sri Lanka is coming from negative territory to positive. And then on the right-hand side, we noticed a couple of important things. Next to last column tells you that the old parties are giving way to new parties. That means the youth is behind the changes taking place now, which means it's good to have fresh air, but it is also increasing instability. And you can see the changes that have taken place. The major parties that are in the back seat now. Maybe they will come back and so forth. Next page, please, Ranjini. Okay, the geopolitics here then, I have three major comments. I will not explain them all. I think you all understand them. The first is that Sheikh Hasina's, the previous prime minister, her approach towards China and India was one of the balancing them. And this year, when she went to both the capitals, she didn't have very positive reception from either. And so somehow that did not work out. And right now it is completely changed. India, as I mentioned earlier, is no longer in the front seat of foreign policy. And so, and China, it doesn't mean has become any farther up, but there are some issues there that need to be seen. Can I go back a couple, please? Somehow you move to the last page. But anyhow, the second item was India's look east has become act east. And as I mentioned earlier, this is not helping Bangladesh much because Bangladesh is really being ignored. From Agartala, the big issue was to bring the northeast of India into the heartland of India. And therefore, Bangladesh was the easiest route to go. But now, instead of coming from Agartala to Kolkata, going through Myanmar, Sitwe to Chennai and Kolkata, kind of has antagonized border people who were even more infuriated by the floods. They've been really agitated by the Ganges-Farakka diversion, and the water has been shrinking. And the more it shrinks in the Ganges and the other rivers, the more it sucks in water from the bay, which means it is saline. So Kushtia and other provinces, districts in the southwest are becoming more saline. And this is also going to affect West Bengal. So there are big problems there that the crowd, the public out there, not policymakers, are not happy with. India needs to come to terms with that if they want to keep popularity. The third one is that the local and the global. The local are the main street people, like our quota reformers. They are the ones that got things going. And you have many counterparts, Pakistan, I'm sure there are some in India. Look at all the rape cases that took place in New Delhi and then now in West Bengal, mostly led by the youth. And therefore, the youth can no longer be ignored like they have traditionally been by the parties. Next page, please. Let me conclude with my six conclusions and the four implications. I think they're fairly straightforward. Number one, for Bangladesh, Hasina is crucial. How India handles Hasina now will be the sine qua non of stability in South Asian future. It is absolutely important. Number two, false information. We saw lots of it over the last 2 months, and BBC reports have shown that many of them are stemming from India. And therefore, we're getting lots of asymmetrical cross-border relationship. This is also unwittingly adding to that. The third conclusion I am drawing is that relations with Pakistan is the one that is warming the fastest. It's again product of the zero-mindedness of the mindset. And just because India is going down, this one has to come up. It's that kind of a game that we must come out of. The fourth one is that China is building safeguards against China and Pakistan, but United States is running more into a very slippery position. And one could foresee some kind of strains between the United States and India, especially with Bangladesh now demanding US attention, resources, and Navy and so forth coming up. The fifth one is that democracy is not working. India had the best election this year anywhere in the world. It stopped populism from expanding even more, but I don't know how long it will stay. And let me stop there. By implications, I think, the four of them, the caretaker government is already shifting India from the front burner to the back burner of Bangladesh policies. The second one, any BNP electoral victory will basically throw bilateral relationship from the frying pan into the fire. The third one, we're seeing the Iron Curtain that I mentioned to you developing, this time not in between East and West Europe, but in South Asia, with Bangladesh being and the last I want to mention is that future Bangla-India relations will be more frayed than they will be stable. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Professor Hussain, for a detailed presentation on Bangladesh. Now, without further ado, so to keep within the time frame, I pass the floor to Professor Srinath Raghavan.
Thank you, Sri. Good evening, everyone. And it's really a pleasure to be speaking here with Rajesh Rajgopalan and Imtiaz Hussain. And since I'm the third in the list of speakers, my task is much easier because they've already covered much of the ground, so to speak, for us. What I want to do perhaps is to take a little bit of a step back and focus on some of the broader sort of themes that I think we need to pay attention to. A lot of the sort of nitty-gritty analysis and detail has been covered, and we can come back to some of those things in the Q&A as well. So here are two broad sets of questions that I really want us to think about. So one is, why is there this degree of turbulence in the region today? And secondly, what does this all mean for India and for Indian foreign policy towards the region, right? So first question of why turbulence? Obviously, every country has its own dynamic, as you've heard, from Afghanistan, Pakistan to Nepal, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Sri Lanka. Every country has its own internal kind of dynamic, which is driving politics in certain kinds of ways. But I think it is possible, if we take a step back, to look at a set of trends which I think are underlying what constitutes this kind of turbulent politics, so to speak. The first of these, as far as I would suggest, are, and in some ways is perhaps the deepest of the trends, is the kind of demographic transition that the region as a whole is undergoing. See, this is a time when country after country in the region is putting more and more young people into the age category of working people, which means that this is typically what demographers refer to as a youth bulge. We can think of it as a demographic dividend or a disaster, depending on what happens to that youth bulge and how all of those people who are of working age, so to speak, are coming forward. And these are typically, historically, always very interesting moments, because this is a time when there are many more people with more wants, needs, expectations, and aspirations which need to be satisfied. So the first I would say is the sort of deep demographic transition that this region is going to undergo for the next decade or so. The second is a trend. If you look back at the last 30 years, South Asia has experienced significant levels of economic growth. There have been, millions of people who have come out of poverty, at least as far as some official definitions of the World Bank and various governments, etc., are concerned. But it is also fair to say that much of this economic development is best characterized as patchy and uneven. It is uneven, not just in the sense of inequality and concentration of wealth, but also about what kinds of opportunities for upward mobility exist, right? And when you put the demographic transition along with uneven economic growth, what we see is that there is a combination of rising expectations of a number of people who are now coming into the sort of age where they have to enter the workforce, but there are increasingly limited opportunities for that kind of upward mobility. Much of this region has already undergone what the economists call premature deindustrialization, right? And Professor Imtiaz Hussain referred to some of those kinds of questions in the context of Bangladesh, as far as unemployment or quality of employment issues. But if you just take a macro picture of the kind of informality that exists in economy across economy in this region, it's actually quite striking. This region accounts for a good 1/5 of humankind, but it also accounts for a very large percentage of people who do not have any kind of formal employment. And I think that combination, along with this demographic trends, is definitely one of the underlying issues. The third underlying trend, as I see, which makes for turbulence in this region, is that in these kinds of circumstances of demographic expansion, of uneven economic growth, and limited options of upward mobility, representative democracy always in these contexts struggles to act as a good economic system, as a political system, right? And I think it's an important point to make. Professor Imtiaz Hussain showed us some charts about what is the situation of democracy, Freedom House rankings and so on. I do not take those rankings particularly seriously for one reason, which is that I believe they all assume that there is a certain normative standard which is set by liberal democracies in the West, and then everybody else is measured according to that. I don't think that necessarily needs to be the only way to think about it. But historically speaking, liberal democracy always has been a representative democracy is a weak political system. It is not a particularly strong political system which is capable of channelizing, so to speak, the will of people all that easily. Yeah, crisis of representation is a very deep one across the democratic world, and we are seeing it play out with particular intensity. This is worth saying. Winston Churchill once said that representative democracy is the best form of government, except for all the others that have been tried from time to time. Right, worst form of government except for all the others that have been tried. That's, I think, a good way of thinking about it, which is to say that it's perhaps the best system that we have, but it is not a system which is necessarily geared to producing the most optimal political and economic outcomes. And that, I think, is kind of borne out by the history of the 20th century very clearly. And it seems to me that currently liberal democracies, particularly in countries of South Asia, are going through one of those phases where there is a significant crisis of representation, which is coinciding with other forms of crises of economic growth and opportunity, leading to an overall crisis of legitimacy, so to speak, of regimes in different kind of locations. So I think if you keep these three macro trends in mind, the demographic transition, uneven economic growth, and limited avenues of upward mobility, and this kind of limitations of liberal representative democracy as a political system, which is fundamental sort of limitations, then I think we get a measure of what are the factors that go into making politics more volatile and turbulent in this region. And of course, as I said, there are country-to-country variations in terms of specifics of what is happening in those situations. We can pick them up in the Q&A, right? Now, these are macro trends which we need to keep in mind as we look at what's happening in the region. Now, I just want to sort of, use the remaining of the time to talk about what I think are Indian policy has faced in the region. Again, a lot of reference has been made to details, so I will stick to some broad points, right? I mean, I think the most useful framework to think about the problem that India faces is to think not so much in terms of what is balancing or bandwagoning between neighbors, which of course is definitely an important issue. But I think the fundamental issue is this, which is that despite India's overarching kind of and overweening presence in the region, India has always been a dominant but not a hegemonic player. Why has it not been hegemonic? It's because its leadership never had the kind of acceptance that you would expect a country which has this level of economic, military, and other kinds of dominance in the region. I mean, just think of it. No other country, two countries share a land border with each other of any significant variety. All of them share land borders with India. I mean, that is the geographic sort of centrality of India to this region. We are found for a very large chunk of the population, a good chunk of the GDP, overwhelming military power. So we are a very dominant actor, but India has never been hegemonic in the region. And part of the region is that in order to be a hegemonic actor, you have to be willing to make certain kinds of sacrifices and not expect everything to pay out in a quid pro quo kind of a way, which I think successive governments of India have always believed has to be the way that this game plays out, right? So in a sense, our dominance is a fact, but hegemony as an aspiration has never been played out in this region. And that, I think today, what we are facing is a deeper crisis of the absence of hegemony as far as Indian foreign policy is concerned. Right? I think that is the framework within which I would like to think about what ails or what affects Indian foreign policy in the region today. The second is, I think if you take a look at the past 10 to 15 years, I mean, particularly I would say the last 10 years, right? And two types of distinctive discourses in the Indian security establishment about right? Now, on the one hand, we say that yes, there is neighborhood first. We have to put our neighborhood interests front and center. This is what matters most for India. So I don't think there is any distinction between different parties, etc., on what needs to be done there. But as far as the Indian state and the Indian security establishment is concerned, I think that there are two sets of discourses which have been in the driver's seat as far as shaping our policy towards the region are concerned. The first of these is something which I would think of as a certain kind of a technocratic discourse, which privileges connectivity, infrastructure, various kinds of projects as the way to build influence in the region. And in a sense, that is seen as attempting to kind of catch up with what the Chinese are doing or do some mirror image of that kind of stuff, right? And that has led to a lot of emphasis on which country, what kinds of projects are we going to do, where are we going to build roads, what kind of energy grids are going to be laid down, etc., right? There is a very certain kind of a technocratic kind of approach towards thinking about this. And the reason I call it technocratic is not because I think it's unimportant. I think actually it's very important, but that it is not fundamentally politically driven, in a sense that there is a sense that political problems can somehow be overcome simply by connectivity and such like things, right? That by building roads, bridges, ports, creating various kinds of access avenues, somehow the deeper political issues can be kind of handled. The second discourse within the Indian security establishment today, particularly in the last few years, is the dominance of what I would think of as a particular viewpoint, which is not so much securitization, but of privileging law and order as the fundamental lens through which to view developments in the region. And I think, if you look at what happened with Sri Lanka some time ago, and what happened this year with Bangladesh, it bears out the point that the Indian government did not and could not appreciate the political dynamics at work. Professor Imtiaz Hussain pointed out that students are at the vanguard of that particular movement in Bangladesh and so on. I think it's fair to say that students have been an important force in Bangladeshi politics since the 1940s. And people forget that Sheikh Mujibur Rahman himself was a student leader for the creation of Pakistan in 1940s. There was a student movement in 1950s for the language. There was a student movement in the 1960s against Ayub Khan regime. At practically every decade of Bangladesh's existence, students have been an important force. Similarly, in the context of Sri Lanka, right? I mean, there have been various kinds of movements and so on. But the Indian security establishment, till the very last minute, failed to appreciate what the gravity of the situation was, simply because you kept thinking that this is simply a law and order question, right? Revolutionary situations cannot be understood that way. Now, again, we can differ on whether it's a positive, negative revolution, it's a revolution or a counter-revolution. But the reality is that the political world in Bangladesh has been turned upside down by a popular mobilization on the streets. And when you are faced with those kinds of circumstances, the law and order perspective, which is privileged by our security managers here in New Delhi, I think tends to mislead very deeply about what is it that is at the driving force here. And again, if you take just to stick to the example of Bangladesh, right? I mean, our view, I don't think there was much engagement that the Indian establishment had with the protesters on the street, even though the movement was building up over a period of time. I think there has been a tendency to view any sort of, party other than the Awami League as effectively some variety of Islamist pro-Pakistan, etc., which is a very gross simplification of the political reality of a country like that. Similarly, there is a sense that is the China angle is played up a lot more in the Indian discourse than perhaps what is warranted by facts on the ground. And I think all of this is fundamentally a consequence of thinking that political unrest in the region is a law and order issue which governments should be able to solve one way or the other. And I think that is the kind of thing which has left us flat-footed as far as this situation is concerned. And we are now handling the consequences of it. Not so much about what Bangladesh government will do. I expect every future government of Bangladesh to want better relations with India, but about how we're going to deal with the problem of, say, Sheikh Hasina being in India, etc. is concerned. So I think the two discourses, one of a technocratic connectivity-based approach, and second discourse of a law and order-based approach towards looking at what is happening in the region, rather than this thing, both of which share one common feature, which is a devaluation of a political understanding of what's happening around us. And I think that is a very significant feature of what is going on as I see it. And I think it's a very serious problem cognitively for the Indian security establishment. And I think this is definitely a relatively new development. And I think this is something that we need to address carefully. Now, it is in this context that I think the China factor, etc., becomes important, because as Rajesh quite clearly laid out, the game is now much more competitive for India, even though we have many advantages. Other countries will look to balance against us by tilting a bit towards China, not necessarily allying with them. That doesn't make any sense. But just as India played these games back in the day during the Cold War, other countries have various kinds of payoffs to do. And I think again, I would second what Rajesh said, which is that we are deluding ourselves if we think that 6% economic growth, being the fastest growing developing economy, etc., is a useful metric when it comes to geopolitics. It is not. It is a useful metric only to attract foreign investment to India. It is only a useful metric to sort of look at how the Indian stock markets are performing. It is not a useful metric to think about geopolitical power and influence in the world. In that game, I think the question of hard capabilities, which in turn is linked much more to question of wealth, right, which is per capita GDP rather than absolute numbers, comes into play. And I think the sooner we let go of this kind of fetishization of abstract numbers like overall GDP growth, etc., the better it is as far as understanding what the competition vis-a-vis China really amounts to and what we can and cannot do in this region. I still believe India has many important cards to play, but that then requires both jettisoning of this kind of security framework within which we've been operating, taking a much more political view of what is happening in the region, and understanding that if you really want leadership in the region, then you have to make certain kinds of asymmetric choices, which will benefit other parties perhaps more than it will benefit you. That is the only way, that's the only road towards any kind of hegemony, which is the only way of making sure that your dominance remains secure and stable in the long run here. And all I'll say is that, the one thing which again Professor Imtiaz Hussain mentioned in his thing, but which I would like to emphasize, is that the reason for India to take up this kind of a leading role in the region is perhaps not even the presence and footprint of China today. That is a fact, it is a geopolitical fact, but I don't think that's the most important thing. I think the most important thing is that some of the most deepest challenges that the region faces, particularly those to deal with our collective environmental future, cannot be solved unless and until countries of the region come together. They cannot be solved unless and until big players like India are willing to take the leadership and make the necessary asymmetric choices in order to enable that kind of collective action to happen. And I think for all of that, a viewpoint about the region which privileges security competition over collective problems is perhaps the wrong way to go. So I would say that, the entire region needs to think hard about what really are the challenges. I don't think China's presence is as great a challenge as right? I mean, the environmental destiny of South Asia hangs or falls together. It is immaterial whether China is ruled by Xi Jinping or somebody else comes or what they do. And there are some things that we need to be able to do which require collective action in the region. And India's leadership will be really tested in whether it can catalyze that kind of collective action, rather than simply whether it can keep China out or keep some pro-India party in power in this or that country. So I would say that let's take a longer and deeper view of what is happening in the region, because I think the challenges are graver than perhaps the turbulence purely in the political world that seems to capture headlines today. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Raghavan. I would like to thank all the three speakers for detailed presentations covering the ground from the and now we'll move on to the I have a few questions and comments, but I'll come in at the end. Let me just go to the and present the questions which have come in so far. The first question, which is addressed to Professor Rajesh Rajagopalan, is from Mohammad Ohiduzzaman. How do you see the increasing dominance of Maoism in Nepal's domestic politics, along with the strengthening economic and political influence China has to gradually increase with India in recent years? So this is for Professor Rajesh. And then we have a question from Professor Indian from Ashish Khemka. Can you please elaborate on what you meant by India's handling of Sheikh Hasina is important to what happens next? Yeah. And then we have Rani Basu, who says, yes, there is, there's a question from there is a delivery deficit, but how far the regimes in the respective countries are responsible for uneven development? What are the options or mechanisms for the states to deal with it? Second, can we think of revival of SAARC in the near? Now, let's have these three questions first.
Somewhat less, I think, because ultimately they all have to deal with the sort of parameters. They are jogs, not move too far away from there are limits of how far they can disentangle. So it's not to as more take a distance from India will go up and down. It's not really it's not just Nepal but others also. but there are limits to that. I mean, it's not like as they can have their free agents in that. So I want that is because of the domestic, what the civic domestic political actors are. You have that back and forth in terms of that policy, but it's like I said, it's also will be somewhat limited.
Thank you.
It's about
Yeah,
Sheikh
that is
Hasina.
from Ashish Khemka. Did you get the question? Shall I read it
Yes,
out again?
yes. It's a good,
Okay,
logical
it is-
question, and it's a very simple answer, and that
Ah.
is that many of her ministers and parliamentarians are now in jail, and there are lots of cases filed against them, some of them for murder, and Hasina also has many accusing her of murder. And so therefore there are lots of cases, and the caretaker government has been trying to come to an agreement with India on this, but Dr. Yunus has not yet, then both plans will able to hide. And that's the prime question. The dominant sentiment here is that she must come and face justice. And unless, because she has gone to India, India is basically the culprit. And unless India can let her come back here to face justice, the relationship is going to turn a little sour more than what it is now. That basically is it, Ashish.
The third question is not any speakers can take up this question. It's not addressed to any specific speaker. Yes, there is from Anil Sagotra, two questions. Yes, there is a delivery deficit, but how far are the regimes in the respective countries responsible for uneven development? What are the options or mechanisms for states to deal with it? Second, can we think of SARC in the near future?
Okay, let me take the
Any of
issue
you?
of uneven development, and I leave SARC to someone else to answer. Now, see, there is no doubt that economic growth, etc., and the patterns of economic growth here in the region are quite heavily influenced still by state policy, right? Despite whatever, several decades of liberalization of the Indian economy, for instance, the state still plays an extremely important role in the way that the patterns of overall economic development in this country operate. So there is, I think, no washing away of hands as far as the state is concerned. I think the state in this entire region, or all the states, are a very important player in determining, the patterns of economic growth. And uneven economic growth, as I said, I mean, particularly if you look at, the manner in which much of the growth which has happened in ways that are leading people into various forms of lives and livelihoods, which are barely sort of scratching the surface of existence, right? I mean, you look at the scale of informalization of an economy like India's. I mean, 93% of Indian people do not have a contract when they work. I mean, this is not a question of saying whether your unemployment is high or low, but it is about what is the quality of employment that we have, and what does that mean for opportunities for sort of social mobility across generations. And I think that is a very important challenge as far as this entire region is concerned. And given that it intersects with this kind of period of demographic bulge, many more young people coming into the working sort of age of their life cycles, I think it's going to be an extremely important question for states across the region to sort of address. And I don't think that we can say that regimes are not responsible. At the end of the day, these are democratic regimes, and they will have to see that what purpose the right populism, right, doing these kinds of schemes, and just at least in India, of politics at state level and welfare schemes are basically ways into this change in some ways in a bit of a limbo. They do not have. I think those kinds of politics will hit their limits, as we are seeing in the context of India. I mean, one of the things you saw with this later in the sort of Indian context was that the same politics does not deliver beyond a certain point, because there is the limit to what same old schemes do, and there is how many schemes you can run. Of under economic change, social change, of how do you make growth patchy and uneven is an important point.
Any of you like to tackle this question?
We something that's happening at the same rates and have to be matched with Sri Lanka, Pakistan to some
improve. It's like competition has definitely helped in enhancing India's skill and capability and actually attention to the issue of delivery. For decades, we talked about delivery, but that was not something that anything very much was about until competition became more serious from China. So I think in that sense, it's sort of it has improved, but it is. I think the comment that was made was that the government also have to pay attention to delivery, not just India, but that's we are not. We are trying, it's misused. It's not something that we have very much of a choice. Hegemony and the difficulty that India has in hegemony. So the question kind of goes against what he was suggesting, which is that India does have difficulty in maintaining hegemony or in asserting hegemony. So hegemony is of course a difficult sort of concept. As Srinath said, it requires followership. It requires a certain amount of, it requires others to accept your leadership. So that is not feasible, irrespective of how dominant you are within a particular regional order. Because I don't think any country is as dominant as India is within the region, within their own region. It's like as I said, about 80%. But that nevertheless it's not possible to assert hegemony simply because because the region is not insular. There are other powers that are outside the region that do have an influence on the region, and so it's not like kind of entirely insular internal system. If there were no other external powers, I think that notion of hegemony, the idea of hegemony, or the capacity for hegemony would become somewhat more possible for India. But as long as there are external powers, I think that will become much more difficult. But the way I think the question was framed was more about the sort of a general, not in sort of the theoretical sense, but more in the general sense of dominance of why is India accused of being a hegemon while China is not. And the reason is simple, which is that India is a neighbor. China is not. And as I said, threat and fear does not travel well over distance. And so countries that are further away are not considered to be as much of a threat and are not as much feared as countries that are closer. And so it's understandable that India would be considered a hegemonic or accused of being a hegemonic power, while China is not.
Thank you. Sanjeet's question for Professor Raghavan. Should I read it out again?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. How does India incentivize Pakistan to change its militaristic attitude, which spills over in the domain of regionalism as well, in order to foster cooperation over collective problems that you highlighted?
Yeah. So, see, I mean, I don't think it is as simple an issue as saying that we can somehow incentivize Pakistan to do it, right? I mean, India and Pakistan have a highly complicated relation for a variety of historical, security, identity-related issues, territorial issues, and so on. And I don't think it's as simple as saying that there are simply some incentives that we can hold out to Pakistan for that to happen. So I don't think that's possible. India-Pakistan relation is the most difficult, complicated, thorny one in the context of South Asia, right? But clearly, India does not share similar relationships, or at least the same gravity of problems with any of the other neighbors. So the question then is, what prevents us from, having actually a form of leadership which incentivizes collective action in the region? And I think there the answer to my mind is that, we are really not thinking about what are the deeper kinds of challenges that the region faces. And I think we are too focused on the here and now, about short-term changes of government, who is favoring us, who is sort of playing along with China, etc. All of which is bound to happen. I mean, politics is a day-to-day transactional activity at some level, but certainly strategic thinking requires us to sort of move beyond the transactionalism of the everyday and look at what are some of the deeper underlying problems. And there, I think the issues are very serious. And what Professor Imtiaz said, say, for instance, about floods, is just one manifestation of the kinds of problems that await us, and which, frankly, no amount of dominance on the part of India is going to be able to solve or insulate us from. So I think it's important, therefore, that we understand and do what we can instead of worrying about what we cannot do. I mean, you cannot incentivize Pakistan. You have a host of problems to settle, which is, even in the best and most optimistic of scenarios, unlikely to be able to be done in any simple way. But what we can do, we should try and do. That's the view I have.
Thank you. And we have another question from Mohammad Ohidul Jaman. Do you think India should reconsider its foreign policy approach by focusing on fostering stronger relations with the people of Bangladesh rather than aligning with specific political parties for particular interests? India has faced criticism for supporting Sheikh Hasina's authoritarian rule over the past 16 years, and during critical moments such as the quota reform movement, where hundreds of students were affected. India's response was limited to stating it was an internal matter. Should India's foreign policy prioritize broader engagement with the Bangladesh populace instead? Any of you would like to tackle this?
I can have a go.
Yeah.
So, see, I do not think the choice is, or whatever. I mean, I don't think the issue is one of whether we engage with the government or we engage with the people, right? I mean, I think you have to do both. Any sensible diplomacy today will involve a measure of, public sort of engagement, which goes beyond the chanceries and the government offices and so on, right? I mean, so I think that is true. But I think in this instance, the failure is not so much of whether we engage with the people of Bangladesh and the kind of response which you correctly quoted. If you look at the Indian statement which was made on the floor of Parliament by the Minister of External Affairs, is a statement which puts the issue as simply one of law and order as far as Bangladesh is concerned, and does not even suggest that there are any appreciation of the political factors which underlay it. Now, I understand that you cannot say things about other countries' internal politics in ways that can damage diplomacy, etc. But I don't think even their internal assessments had any degree of clarity about where this situation was headed, and that is principally because we do not have a political understanding of what's happening. I think too much of our understanding is through the lens of a security establishment which privileges law and order as the most important framework within which to understand what's happening in the region, or security competition with China or Pakistan. And in the context of Bangladesh, I must say that there is a tendency to overprivilege the sort of concern about minorities. That is not the only problem that India has with Bangladesh. I mean, there are many other issues at stake. It's such a large and important neighbor. And as Professor Imtiaz said, Bangladesh has been one of the stalwart allies of India in the region. We've had such a close relationship with that country. So to boil that down to simply a concern about minorities, which is repeated time and again, suggests that we are taking a very highly sort of sectarian view of what is happening in that country. All of which only betrays a deeper sort of lack of political understanding of what the country is undergoing. And I would say that much the same has been the case with other countries like Sri Lanka, which have seen very extraordinary levels of political upheaval in the recent past.
Just a couple of that to Moin's question, and that is simply that lot is happening on both fronts. We're not paying attention to that. Do you know that there are 150,000 Bangladeshis at least that go to India for medical treatment? Chennai, Kolkata, they're filled with them. That's a lot of money, and lots of networks are coming out of that at the social level. So let's not say that it's only happening at the upper level. The big difference is that during our generation, the older generation, we were used. For example, I have seen border war, Pakistan, India, 1965. The borders were completely closed. We could not go anywhere. And now that there is a Moitri train going from Dhaka to Kolkata and is going every work day, it means that there's a lot happening at the bottom level. We're not paying attention to, at the bottom level, Bangladeshis have gotten so rich, they go and spend it all in places like Singapore, India, and Bangkok. So I don't think that, you know, the younger generation, they also now have the fourth industrial revolution, and that is breaking barriers everywhere, social media everywhere. So I think there's a lot happening that has not come out or been formalized. And you, the younger generation, I'm so sorry about this, but you're seeing everything through our eyes. We are the ones who are framing the policies, constructing everything the way we saw everything 30, 40, 50, 60, 80 years ago. Lots of changes have taken place, but we have not made that change. And what else can I say?
Thank you. You know, we are running out of time. We just got about 3 or 4 minutes left. So there's just one final question, which I think Srinath has already addressed slightly, but I'll just throw it out. If we get a quick answer from any of you, and then I'll just wrap up. Thank you. From Naomi Shireen, how should India proceed in terms of the minority oppression in Bangladesh? What should be their future policy? Yeah. Quick answer from any of you.
Sorry, I
Srinath,
didn't
Rajan?
understand the question. Could you read it out again?
Yeah. From Naomi Shireen, how should India proceed in terms of minority oppression in Bangladesh? What should be India's future policy?
Right. No, see, in terms of to the extent that there is a significant Hindu minority in Bangladesh, and we know that in the past, whenever there have been sort of attacks against minorities, there has always been a movement of flow of people towards India, etc. It is but natural that the Indian establishment is bound to kind of take cognizance of that. But I think this particular government in India has a certain kind of an ideological view of that problem as well, which leads them to overemphasize or to index that particular question, right? I think it's important to look at what is happening on the ground rather than only keep laying up your fears about what's happening, which is not to say that those fears are baseless or that they do not happen. But let's also remember that the entire region has problems of minorities, of ethnic populations which are spread across national borders, which is one of the reasons why I think in some ways South Asia is either we hang together or we are going to hang separately, right? I mean, so it's one of those kinds of questions in the long run. We cannot take a view that some countries in the region can be insulated from certain types of majoritarianism, whereas others will not, right? I mean, majoritarianism has been a dominant trend in country after country in the region, including in India. And I think it's important, therefore, that we take a broader view of what is happening and say that unless and until there is a consensus towards democratic norms across the region, and Professor Imtiaz Hussain showed us what is the stand there, at least on certain kinds of metrics and so on, which is that democracy is not in great health in this region, and I think it's important that unless and until there is a greater convergence towards those kinds of democratic norms and understandings and a commitment towards protection of minorities across the board, these are not problems that can be individually solved only by one country, etc. And I think that is something that we need to really clearly understand.
Thank you. Thank you. Now we just have a minute left, so I'll just make the concluding remarks. I I think international relations theory tells us, and coalition theory also, which I work on in Indian politics, tells us that the largest partner to build a community around itself, the largest partner has to be relatively more accommodative, in the sense that this is like the US in post-war Europe, and all the way till now, NATO has remained a stable and in fact expanding alliance, because the largest partner has been willing to accept a disproportionate share of the costs, and more than proportionate share of the costs, and a less than proportionate share of the benefits. And it has maintained an open market in terms of exports to the US, allowing other countries to grow over the decades on the basis of American openness and also openness to immigration. Now, in South Asia, we don't have that situation. India is remained a relatively protectionist economy, including about the exports of its neighbors. Now that, and it has also been relatively closed door in terms of immigration, that has produced a big reaction in places like Assam, for example. So it is not yet doing the things which are, in theory, needed to build a stable community or to incentivize bandwagoning, rather than the hedging behavior that you see between India and China. I mean, countries are hedging. They are trying to play both sides. Now, in the long term, the question I raised at the beginning about the India's rising trajectory, can it go ahead without a bandwagoning region? In principle, yes, if you are big enough, like the Chinese, they have problems with India, with Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, many of them, Vietnam, but they have still reached great power status. If you are big enough economically and militarily, you can do that. But it's not easy to do that, and especially for India. And as Srinath said, the region environmentally, ecologically needs cooperation if it's not to sink in a world in which climate change is becoming vital in terms of survival. So I'll just leave it with those remarks that, we need to, and one of the speakers made a reference to this sort of non-reciprocal openness. This was actually put in place, at least in words, in the so-called Gujarat Doctrine in late 90s, but it has basically been sidelined in past decade or more. So I'll leave it with that. We need to think theoretically, in terms of what is needed in a region where, and what the largest player in such a region needs to do to incentivize regional community. I'll leave it at that. And I'd like to thank all the three speakers for wonderful presentations, and thank all of you who came here, who took time out to attend this webinar and participate. And also thank my colleagues, Ranjani, who has coordinated this, and Tisha and Jacqueline. So thank you all very much, and have a wonderful rest of the evening or rest of the day, depending upon where you are. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.